Hello, this lecture is going to go over ethical, causal, and proposal arguments, which are the three argument types you need to include in your researched argument. So first we're going to start with ethical arguments. And ethical arguments are arguments about what is right and wrong, or what is good and bad. In other words, you're actually making a judgment about the morality or ethics of a particular policy or action or idea. These usually involve an argument about whether or not something should or should not be done because it is right or wrong. We're really not too concerned with those moral questions that aren't applicable because your arguments need to appeal to kairos. We need to feel like it's essential that that argument's being made at this time and place. And so really this comes down to what should we do? Is something happening that shouldn't be happening? Do we need to stop it? Or is something need to be done about a problem because it's the right thing to do? And these types of arguments depend on support from ethical principles. Those are standards of right and wrong found in one or more religions, philosophies, and/or other codes of ethics. In other words, you want to draw from values that people have and use those values to support your argument. And these are not just arguments about what is legal or illegal. As King makes clear in his argument in Letter from Birmingham Jail, sometimes the law is actually wrong and needs to be changed. Sometimes something that is illegal should happen, that is actually the right thing to do. So while some people may feel that we should just follow the law blindly and not ever question it, you don't want to say that something is the right thing to do because it's legal or it's wrong because it's illegal and leave it at that. You want to make sure you have some ethical backing for your argument and show why something is right or is wrong and should be changed or should be done. So a couple of examples. One is arguments about college education and whether or not college education should be subsidized. So for example, having Pell Grants and student loans that are subsidized and so on. With an ethical argument, some people would use the value that, everyone has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and education is important in that, and everyone should have equal access, and therefore it's the right thing to do to subsidize education for those people who can't afford it on their own. On the other hand, some people might argue that by doing that, we're paying money for people who don't really care about their educations and don't earn them. They're just wasting taxpayer money. They're, getting Pell Grants and then not passing classes and just using it for frivolous things. And they would say, well, actually, it's the wrong thing to do because it's not being used properly. And that people should have to earn their education so that they use that, they put value into it. And so that would also be an ethical argument. So notice that an ethical argument doesn't mean that you're arguing one position that's the right position. It means that you're using values and beliefs to back your argument and show whether or not something's right or wrong. So people with different opinions can both be making ethical arguments, but using different values to create that ethical argument. That doesn't mean anything goes. That doesn't mean we can, just make any argument and call it ethical. It just means that there can be differences of opinions on some issues. The same is true with this other example, an argument about whether or not suspected terrorists held in Guantanamo Bay have the right to a trial. Some people would use their ethical argument and base that on, the right to a fair trial, fair and speedy trial, and say that because we want to make sure we apply our values in all cases, we don't want to just apply those to citizens. And that it's the right thing to do to have a trial so that we don't hold people who are innocent unnecessarily. And other people would argue that actually the main value that we need to respect is that of the safety of Americans, and they would base their ethics on those kinds of principles. So again, there can be disagreement. So the best ethical arguments, though, are based on ethical principles that are self-evident and don't need to be explained. In other words, these are ones that everyone can relate to and understand. And these are also based on ethical principles that are widely accepted, regardless of one's religion, culture, etc. In other words, for example, if you argue that something is the right thing to do because it protects everyone's right to have their property protected, um, that will be more effective than saying, well, in the Christian religion, we have the right to have our property protected because the Ten Commandments say, thou shalt not steal, right? So even though that is an ethical principle that's found in every religion, every culture, that one's property is their own and shouldn't be taken from them, instead of focusing on the religion, just using that ethical principle is going to be most effective. And that's another one that typically doesn't need to be explained. Of course, we have some that are more complicated, right? That some people would disagree on what it means to right to life, for example. Um, so some arguments need to be a little more complicated in their ethical arguments. So this is why we have the recommendation that you don't use one particular religion to make your argument. If a person doesn't belong to that same religion, they aren't likely to accept the argument. And that's the case even if they hold that same value. They're going to be focused more on being preached at. They're going to start to become a little more resistant to that. So some complications in ethical arguments. One is that if the audience does not accept the ethical principle on which the argument is based, they are unlikely to accept the claim. For example, if I were to say that college tuition in the United States should be something that is paid for universally, that so that all students can afford a college education, if not everyone accepts that taxpayers should have to subsidize educations in order for everyone to have equal access, they're not likely to accept that claim. And so I need to first argue for that value and try to convince them of it. Also, if the arguer does not clearly explain the ethical principle on which the argument is based, the audience may not realize they share common ground with the arguer. For example, if I don't explain in my argument that college education should be accessible to everyone without cost, without student loans, and so on, then people might um, feel like they don't quite understand why I'm making my argument. So they might not understand that I feel that everyone should have that right to a college education. And as you think about these ethical arguments, it helps to think about what other people's values and beliefs are that they're coming to the argument from. So, for example, with that argument about college education, if I realize that, okay, some people really feel that you should have to earn whatever you have or whatever you get and don't want money to be wasted, I could add in an argument that there should be some merit earnings of free education. For example, you have to keep your grades up. Maybe you have to volunteer. There can be some strings attached as we offer that education to everyone. And that could help me convince more people because they're seeing that I can have considered their values and beliefs. And while I have my own, I'm considering both and trying to find a common ground between the two arguments. Okay. So those are ethical arguments. The next argument type is the causal argument, and this is not casual arguments with those, the lettering in the spelling. Sometimes students get these mixed up, but it's about causal, so cause and effect. So some examples that we've seen in the past 10 years or so, we've seen arguments about the causes of the recession, and now arguments about the causes of the recession and concerns that there might be another recession, arguments about the causes of low voter turnout, arguments about the effects of media violence, and arguments about the effects of funding cuts for public education. All of these, both the arguments about causes and about effects, are considered causal arguments. So some considerations for causal arguments. When you're thinking about causes, often you need to focus on what the most important or immediate causes are, and especially when you're writing a shorter essay for a class rather than a major, hundreds of pages of analysis, you have to focus on what seems most important. If you're really delving into causes, you might also want to look at what are some more less important, less immediate causes like contributing or remote causes. So for example, if I'm looking at why students don't succeed and trying to figure out all the causes, I would look at these as well, not just the most important and immediate causes. You want to think about whether or not you can trace a causal chain, so a sequence of events, just being careful that you're not confusing a sequential relationship with causation. So that post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. In other words, just because one thing happens first, that doesn't mean that whatever follows was caused by it. And so you want to avoid assuming that a causal relationship when there isn't one. So when you're thinking about causes for your research argument, you want to look at why. Why is this problem happening? What are the causes of the problem? And like I said, you can't usually focus on all of them. You have to figure out what seems most important for the scope of the argument. When you're thinking about effects, same issue with focus. You have to think about the most important effects of an event or of an issue. In a longer paper, for example, when you write a 123 researched argument, you might also want to consider minor effects that should be considered. But typically for this class, it's just the most important effects. So what is happening because of the problem? And you want to tie those to the causes that you've identified. Also, if an event hasn't taken place yet, you often need to think about the potential effects. So in other words, if you're, we'll get into proposal arguments in a moment, if you're thinking about what action should be taken place, you may need to consider what the potential effects of that action would be. As you do this, though, be careful to avoid a slippery slope fallacy or assuming an action will result in dire consequences. So, for an example, this often comes up with debates about the Second Amendment. One person might say, well, if we start to allow background checks for gun shows, then the government will take away all of our guns. Notice that that's a huge leap. So it's actually a slippery slope fallacy, assuming that any kind of regulation will lead to dire consequences. And so anytime you want to connect cause and effect, make sure that you have all of those links in place. So when you're proving causes and effects, make sure you show clear connection between events or between actions and consequences. And make sure you support your arguments about causes and or effects with evidence. So if you're trying to say that, for example, maybe my argument is that one of the causes of students not graduating from high school is that they feel like their education doesn't matter. I need to show evidence. I need to try to provide proof that that's the case. And same thing with effects. I need to try to prove that it's the case, not just claim that it's cause or an effect without any evidence. And I also need to avoid non sequitur fallacies, so gaps in my reasoning. If you don't fully connect cause and effect and try to show the links, then your readers aren't going to understand your reasoning. And so make sure you don't leave any of those gaps. Okay, sorry about that glitch. I accidentally put the same lecture in twice and forgot the third one. So next we have proposal arguments. And these are arguments that suggest a solution to a problem. So some examples are arguments about how to reduce the federal deficit. Should we cut spending? Should we raise taxes? Should we do a combination of the two? All of those would be arguments that propose a solution. We also have arguments about how to improve elementary schoolers' test scores. Any argument about what should be done would be a proposal argument, and the same is true for arguments about how to reduce our dependence on foreign oil. So, constructing a proposal argument. The first thing that you need to do is establish the problem. Sometimes your audience already accepts the problem and you can just sum it up for context, but that's not always the case. Sometimes your audience doesn't know that the problem exists, and so if that's the case, you need to provide extensive context and first argue that there is a problem. So letting them know that this is an issue. Often people disagree on whether or not something is a problem, so sometimes you have to prove that it is. And if people disagree on what exactly the problem is, you will likely need to start with a causal argument. And that's the case for your researched argument. You'll need to be able to show, okay, here's the cause of the problem, here's an effect or more than one effect, and here's my proposed solution to it. So once you've established that, then you propose a solution, and this is why in your research argument, you'll first argue for causes and effects and then provide your solution. As you think about your proposal argument and your solutions, make sure that your solution is practical and feasible. In other words, ask yourself, is it a logical solution to the specific problem? Is it simple enough to be implemented within the necessary time frame, or does it create too many additional problems to work properly? Are the physical resources available? Is the necessary funding available? And of course, is it legal and constitutional? And so all of these issues may be things that you have to consider. And in terms of it being legal and constitutional, don't assume that just because it's not legal or it is illegal that can't be changed, but be very careful about arguing for something that's not constitutional. If, for example, you said that no one should be able to put their opinions on Facebook, that's obviously not going to be constitutional, so it's not a good proposal or solution for the issue of people having arguments on Facebook. As you construct your proposal argument, try to prove that your solution is the best solution to the problem. So provide evidence to prove your solution's feasibility. In other words, evidence to show that your solution could happen. Also discuss the potential benefits of your solution, again providing evidence to support your projected outcome, and show why your solution is better than alternative solutions if needed. So this is comparison with evidence. With this research argument, you don't have as much time to compare to other solutions, but if there is another solution that's more popular or seems more prevalent, you may need to do this. In real world arguments, workplace, for example, you're often going to need to show why this is the better option. So some complications of proposal arguments. One is that people can't agree on a solution if they can't agree on the problem. And so that's why that causal argument is so important before you have a proposal argument. Also, there is sometimes an ethical argument or an argument over values hiding beneath disagreements about solutions. So for example, with the healthcare issue, there's a lot of debate about what the best solution is. Should we have a single payer system so everyone's just covered under government insurance? Should we just have it tied to people's work and, everyone pays for their own insurance? Often there's an argument over values that's behind that. So one argument might be concerned primarily with debt and, should we implement any solution that would cost taxpayers more? And then other people might argue that, well, it's not about that. It's about making sure everyone has equal access to health care. And then, of course, there's practical arguments within this as well. Like, does it really cost more to have a single payer system with what we're already paying for people who aren't insured and so on? Is that actually the issue? And so these are combined. It's not something you can totally separate from other types of arguments, like causal arguments. Then actual solutions often need to be complex and can involve compromise and partial implementation of several solutions. We see that, for example, with the health care plan that we have now. When President Obama was going through this healthcare reform and trying to find a solution, um, his solution was then modified to address Congress and their concerns. And so we ended up with the solution based on all of that. And sometimes that makes a bigger mess, right? Sometimes it doesn't work as well as another solution would. But sometimes we really need to have those compromises and partial implementation of several solutions so that everyone's concerns are met and we get the best solution. This may not be something you need to worry about with your researched argument, especially with this being something that's so much shorter than a healthcare policy, for example. And then, of course, people are generally resistant to change of any kind. So, if you want to think about that as you're proposing a solution, remember that people may not want change. And so you have to convince them that this is the best for them and for everyone else. So that's it for this lecture. Sorry it's so a bit rambly and I've lost my voice off and on throughout, but I'll post the slides as well in case you just want to look at those. I hope this is helpful and let me know if you have any questions as you work on your researched argument.